Good morning. Welcome to Connection, coming to you from Spirit and Truth Sanctuary. Last week, I had a little bit of a brain fart, I guess, and after it was over, Benny said, I want to run this back and check something. And I said, okay. He said, I think you said coming to you from Spirit and Truth Saturday. And I did. So if you caught that last week, I have no idea why I said Spirit and Truth Saturday rather than Spirit and Truth Sanctuary. However, I am coming to you this morning from Spirit and Truth Sanctuary. So let's begin with our morning blessing. Spirit of Truth, we give thanks today for our connection in this time of togetherness, for our sameness as well as our contrast, and for the light we reflect to one another and see in one another. We give thanks for the holy that holds us and for the humanity that always brings us back to the holy. We ask that our happiness, our peace, and our joy now be woven into the fabric of the world around us, and that it serve as nourishment to feed the heart of the collective. In the name and nature of the Christ, amen, and so it is. All right, on to our quotes. Everything is energy, and that's all there is to it. Match the frequency of the reality you want, and you cannot help but get that reality. It can be no other way. This is not philosophy. This is physics. Albert Einstein. Now, that is the one and only quote we'll have today, but that one is quite enough because it covers a huge topic. And that's what our title is today. We say that sentence a lot. Everything is energy. But what does it really mean? And more importantly, what impact does it have on our individual lives? When some people hear that quote or the phrase, everything is energy, they tend to dismiss it immediately because they think, oh, that's just some airy-fairy, woo-woo spiritual jargon that doesn't have any real-world implications. So I think it's important to note, for the sake of those people, that Einstein, who is regarded as one of the most gifted scientists of the 20th century, added this statement at the very end of that quote, to the very end of that quote. This is not philosophy, this is physics. In essence, he was going ahead and giving an answer to those people who would discount what he was saying on the grounds that they saw this as just a philosophy and not real science. I'm not sure how much more real you can get in the world of science than Albert Einstein. So what he's talking about here and what we'll talk about today isn't just some idea somebody had because they wanted to sound spiritual. This is all based on actual science, and it's what has become known as quantum physics. I want to begin today by picking up where we left off last week with one of the quotes I gave you then. I'm going to repeat it and what I said about it, and then we will continue on from there. I said, the universe responds to your frequency. It doesn't recognize your personal desires, wants, or needs. It only understands the frequency in which or at which you are vibrating. So if you are vibrating in the frequency of fear, guilt, or shame, you will attract things and people who are in a similar vibration. If you are vibrating in the frequency of love, joy, and abundance, you will attract things and people who are in and that support that frequency. It's exactly like a radio station. You have to be tuned in to the kind of music you want to listen to. You have to be tuned in to the energy you want to manifest, and it will change your life. End quote. And so then I said, some people will be disheartened and discouraged by that quote because all they hear is, God doesn't care about my needs, wants, and desires. He doesn't show his love for me by actions or by giving me things. But when you really listen to that, you realize that it's a pretty immature level to be living on, and it implies in a way that you are a bit of a victim because you are at the mercy of whether or not God decides to give you things based on whether or not he thinks you're worthy or based on your behavior. A more mature ear hears in that quote, hey, The power is actually all within me. God is love, and the love that he is always available to me, and all I have to do is get myself on the frequency of love, or we could also refer to it as the frequency of God, because as we know, they are one and the same. God is love. So in this scenario, all the power is actually in your hands. You're not waiting on God to bestow anything upon you. You can have all the love he has to offer just by sending out the frequency of the love that he is. And if you do that, love comes back to you. It is a universal law. So in retrospect, that's actually a pretty comforting quote if you just open up your mind a little, and if you're listening with a mature spiritual ear, not your ego's small-minded, immature ear. So that quote, and then my commentary on it, which I just read you, was talking about us getting on to or tuning into a certain frequency. And I will use the words frequency and energy somewhat interchangeably today. They're not quite the same thing, but they are similar enough for the purposes of this particular teaching. I came across a piece this week that confirms that quote, what that quote was saying, and says what I was saying in a little different way, and goes further by giving a really good illustration that I think will help give us a physical picture that we can relate to when we're comparing things according to the different levels of maturity or enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. Like when I said a minute ago, on an immature level, you hear a statement like, God doesn't love you, and you stop listening right there and shut down in a panic, rather than continue listening to the rest of the thought, which is that the subtext of that statement is that God doesn't love as an action because God is love. God is the frequency of love, and that frequency that he, she, it is always available to us. Love isn't something that's given. It's a frequency that just is. And it's within our power to get on or to tune into that frequency. Understood on this level, we are not at the mercy of any external being who can decide whether to love us or not. The power isn't outside of us. It's up to us to decide whether or not we want to match the frequency of love. So it's not a depressing quote at all from that perspective. Here's the piece I want to share with you from a guy named Aaron Abke, who's being interviewed by our friend Kyle Cease, who I've quoted to you many times before. Interestingly, this guy, Aaron, is a former worship leader who left the church and moved beyond Christianity in search of a little bigger version of God and of spirituality, much like many of us have. And he's talking here about people being bummed out, is the way he phrases it, when they hear that we're all one and that no one is separate from anyone else, because they think that that means you're no longer special to God. But it's really just a matter of seeing things from a different level of maturity. He says, when we talk about the non-duality of a person and that all of us are actually one with each other and with God, what the ego hears is an extremely depressing message, because all it hears is the loss or the perceived loss of control, which is the ego's worst nightmare. In other words, what the ego hears is, if I'm no longer an individual, then I no longer have control over my separate individual life. But the message isn't that you had control or were in control at one time, that you were really a separate self, but now that you've heard the message of enlightenment, you are no longer separate and have now lost control. The message is that you were never separate from God or from your fellow man in the first place. That's always been an illusion or a delusion. But still, even though you've never been able to control situations and circumstances, look at all the things that have happened through you, through your connectedness to Source. So, this message is actually the most expansive message ever. You've been playing small, following your ego and believing your ego self is who you are. Now, here's the visual that he gives that I was talking about. He says, it's like you have this one penny in your hand and you're holding on to it for dear life because that's all you think you have, when there's $20 billion sitting in a pile behind you and all you have to do is turn around and see it. And when you do that, you'll understand how little value that penny, which represents your ego self, actually has. And you won't be so afraid to let it go. What could be more liberating than realizing you are the entire universe in ecstatic motion? Okay, so I love that illustration that he gives there, and I want to relate it now to what my brother was talking about on Sunday. When we are viewing ourselves through the lens of our ego, we're identifying with a form, our physical form as well as the form of our mind and our intellect, which is what his message was about. This is that part of us who thinks we have the ability to keep it all together, that if we work really hard, we can get to where we want to go through our effort or our discipline or whatever other temporary modality we're depending on and have allowed ourselves to become attached to. That part of us that thinks we can figure everything out if we just have enough information and correctly apply our logic and reasoning to it. But that is all just identifying with various forms and leaves no room for what we're talking about today, energy, which is what we all are and what everything else is as well. Energy is not a form. It is what is contained within a form. On Sunday, my brother described it as being like water. He talked about water being able to take on 3 different forms. The one that we actually refer to as water, it's liquid form, but it can also be solid as ice when it freezes or steam when it heats up. It's all still water. And then he took a drink to illustrate that the same water that was just contained in his water bottle is now contained within his body, but it's the same water. The point being that spirit is just like that. Spirit is contained within many forms, but it is not the form itself. And then he talked a bit about the danger of allowing ourselves to get attached to forms or mistaking them for spirit. I'm going to read now a little of what he said, and then I'll expand on it. He said, spirit can be housed in Christianity. Spirit, truth, connection to God can be housed in Islam. It can be housed in Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism. It can be housed in yoga. It can be housed in nature. It can be housed in anything because it is above our definitions and forms. And then he told the story about the man in the Bible the woman in the Bible rather, who her husband died. She married his brother, and the person asked Jesus, whose wife will she be in heaven? And so then he explained that Jesus' answer was that she wasn't going to be either of their wives in heaven. He says, you are projecting into the spiritual world, which contains no form, things and concepts that belong to this material world. You are trying to put thought form identity in the same category as spiritual essence, and those two things are not compatible. He went on to say, whatever you set yourself up as or see yourself as, whatever form you identify with in this temporary world will end when your physical form dies in this temporary world. No labels or identities get carried with your spirit when it exits this fleshly tent. When your tent dies, when you trade in this temporary living space, you go back to being pure spirit. Now, time out, also known as energy. But the point I want to make is we're always energy. We don't just become or turn into spirit or energy when we die. We are always energy. We just lose our temporary form or house when we physically die. So now this is me talking. My question today is, so if that's the case, why not just identify with that now? We'll talk in just a few minutes about how the entire concept of time is a part of this worldly, earthly, temporary existence, and how when you stop identifying with it, your whole world changes. But right now, I want to remind you of one of my favorite quotes by Andrew Martin. He says, the only claim the divine ever makes is, I am. And so anything we add after that is a lie. Now, that's a really strong way to put it, and that word lie carries a very negative connotation. So how about this? Anything we add after the words I am white, I am a woman, I am a Christian, I am an American, is just a temporary label, an earthly form that we can put on and take off whenever we want to, but it's not who we are at our core. At our core, we are just the I am, and that's all. So the reason I went through all of that explanation was to lay a foundation that differentiates this world of form from the energy that we are at our core. Our bodies, all of our labels, and as we're about to talk about, time itself are just containers of and for our energy. And once we understand that difference, as I said, our whole world changes because our perception of who we are changes. As my brother also talked about a little on Sunday, time is an earthly container. And when we try to apply spiritual principles and concepts or somehow try to fit them into time, which is an earthly concept, we get into trouble. That's when we start believing things like we have to wait on God to decide when He's going to bless us. We have to wait on our season of favor rather than knowing, as He said on Sunday, that where you stand, God is. So there's literally no waiting on God. You're waiting on yourself. When we try to make God in our image, as I talked about last week, we think we have to be in a certain place for God's Spirit to fall. But that's not how it works. When you realize you yourself are pure energy, the pure energy of the I am, and therefore you're not waiting on anything and you don't have to be in any certain place because time and space are both earthly containers which spirit transcends, okay? So it's the energy or spirit within you that determines what frequency you're on. Like I said on Sunday, all possible outcomes to every situation already exist. It's not like we're walking down the road and making this particular turn and then that turn until we finally arrive at our destination, and that if we don't make the right turns at the right time, we'll miss it, or things will turn out differently because we made a mistake or we took a wrong turn. No, every outcome is always here. They're just on different levels of frequency, and the way we choose our preferred outcome or destination is to match whatever frequency it is on. Time, in the linear sense, where you have to do this and then wait and then travel this specific distance and make this turn and then wait some more, doesn't exist in the world of energy and frequency and spirit. I'm going to read to you now a short piece by Michael Beckwith, and in it, he talks about walking towards something. But if you hear what he's saying with immature ears, the immature ears of your ego, then it will have an entirely different meaning than what he's saying. So remember that today we're talking about the fact that everything is energy. And when you're looking at it and listening to it from that perspective, you're not dealing with the forms of time or space. I'll try to explain further after I read it. He says we have to understand that fear is an energy, and as such can never be destroyed once created. But it can be transmuted. You do this by changing or choosing the frequency of it. For example, fear can become excitement, and excitement can become enthusiasm. I never tell people to get rid of their fear. It can't be done as long as we remain in this human realm. But in order to transmute the energy and frequency of the fear, you first admit that it's there. Okay, I'm afraid, but I'm going to walk in the direction of my good, of something better. If you continue to walk towards something better, that begins the process of transmutation. All right, so let's break this down a little. When he uses the phrase walk in the direction of, if we're thinking in terms of the forms of time and space, that means there's a possibility we're going to get it wrong, or that we're going to choose the wrong direction, or that it might take a long time or a lot of effort to overcome or to transmute this energy of fear. But the key thing he said here is that it's an energy, and therefore it's not subject to the human forms of time or space. So instead of thinking of this as a process that takes a lot of time and effort and could possibly fail because you might never reach the destination you desire, which is the transmutation of fear into excitement and then into enthusiasm, you realize excitement and enthusiasm are already there simultaneously with the fear, because they're all just on different frequencies of the same energy. They're all just different choices that you have in front of you at the same time. We've talked about that before too. Think about the physical manifestation of fear. Your heart rate increases. You might feel butterflies in your stomach. Your hands might start to sweat. Your senses are heightened and you get very alert and aware to your surroundings. Seen from a different perspective, those are also the same physical manifestations as excitement. So you can choose which label you want to give those manifestations. You can label them fear, or you can label them excitement. The label you give them is the form they take. But that's what's inside. But at the inside, it is the same core energy that is just waiting to be labeled or transmuted by you. So when you see it in this way, it's not like a place you need to go or a destination that takes a certain amount of time and effort to get to. It's more like just standing in front of a buffet and choosing what you want to eat and putting it on your plate. That's so much easier, right? So side note here, something else I learned this week. The word enthusiasm comes from the word enthuse, which originally meant to channel the gods or to access the divinity that lives within us and that is us. Isn't that interesting? When we know we are divine, when we recognize the Christ spirit, the Christ consciousness within us, then we understand that we are not our labels and we are not our forms. Going back to the quote by Andrew Martin, the divine only ever makes one claim: I am. Anything added after that is temporary. And if everything is energy, then we get to choose what temporary label we put on it. Whatever we encounter, we need to remember that it's just energy, and as such can be transmuted. But that's not necessarily a lengthy and arduous process. It's just a matter of what container we decide to put it in. We can choose for it to be fear or excitement, a problem or an opportunity, a roadblock or a stepping stone, a failure or a valuable lesson. So I want to start closing today by going back to a teaching I did several years ago called "There is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path," which is a quote I borrowed from Pastor Lonnie. And although this is specifically talking about happiness, it can be talking about anything. You'll see what I mean when I start reading it. I think it will be a perfect way to wrap up this idea we've been exploring today that everything is energy. And because that's true, you're not on a path like in linear time. The path just is. Everything is happening all at once from an energetic standpoint, and you can just stand still and choose what frequency you want to vibrate on at any given time. Any frequency you want to plug into, you can. I'm going to read a piece by Michael Singer from a book called The Untethered Soul about the path of unconditional happiness, and then go on to tell another story about what can happen if we refuse to let go of our attachment to forms and containers. And I can tell you already, it is a much less desirable outcome. So Michael Singer says, the highest spiritual path is life itself. If you know how to live daily life, it all becomes a liberating experience. But first, you have to approach life properly. Okay, so as I've been saying, you have to approach it from that perspective of I am. First, you have to realize that you really only have one choice in this life, and it's not your career, who you marry, or even the choice to seek God. People tend to burden themselves with so many choices, but in the end, you can throw it all away and just make one basic underlying decision. Do you want to be happy or not? It's really that simple. Once you make that choice, your path through life becomes totally clear. Most people don't dare give themselves that choice because they think their happiness is not under their control. Some might say, well, of course I want to be happy, but my wife left me. In other words, they want to be happy, but they can't be if their wife leaves them. But that wasn't the question. The question very simply was, do you want to be happy or not? If you keep it that simple, you will see that it really is under your control. It's just that you have a deep-seated set of preferences that gets in the way. If you are hungry enough, your food preferences fall by the wayside. It's the same with happiness. The question is simply, do you want to be happy? If the answer is really yes, then you must say it without qualifying it. Okay, so what he's saying here by making this comparison is, look, you may dislike or not prefer a certain type of food, but if you're starving and someone offers you that particular food, you're not going to turn it down. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, if I'm starving and somebody hands me an onion, even though I detest onions, I'm going to eat it if I'm hungry enough. So, if your desire to be happy or for anything is strong enough, you will stop putting conditions on how it comes to you. When you're starving, all food, any food is good. When you really want to be happy, you'll find a way. Okay, back to the book. What the question, do you want to be happy or not, really means is, do you want to be happy for the rest of your life from this point forward, regardless of what happens? If you say yes, it might happen that your wife leaves you, or your husband dies, or the stock market crashes, or you lose all your money, or your car breaks down on a secluded highway at night. Those things or things like that might very well happen between now and the end of your life. But if you want to walk the highest spiritual path, then when you answer yes to that simple question, you must really mean it with no ifs, ands, or buts. If you qualify your willingness to be and to stay happy by saying, I will be happy if this happens, or if that doesn't happen, that's when your happiness is out of your control because you are attaching conditions to it. Or like we were saying earlier, you're putting it into a form, into a container. And conditions will always be beyond your control. The bottom line is any condition you create only serves to limit your happiness. If you decide you want to be happy from now on for the rest of your life, your answer in the affirmative to the question, do you want to be happy, must be unconditional. This is truly a spiritual path, and it's a direct and sure path to awakening as could possibly exist, because once you decide you want to be unconditionally happy, something inevitably will happen that challenges your commitment to this. And this test of your commitment is exactly what stimulates your spiritual growth. All right, now I want to stop right here and say this. This doesn't happen with just this one decision, this decision to be happy. It happens with any decision you make concerning a spiritual path. It could be a decision you make to unconditionally love people, or to take a vow of celibacy if that's what you want to do, or poverty. There are thousands of paths people have chosen down through history to be their path to spirituality. And this happens with each of these things. When you make an unconditional commitment or a vow about anything, it's going to be tested. Happiness just happens to be one, but it's a universal principle. And the question always comes down to, what is the point at which you decide to break that vow? And that is always within your control. So in that regard, you can't say, well, my happiness is beyond my control because circumstances are sometimes beyond my control. That's true. But that's also why, if you're going to make this commitment, it can't be dependent upon circumstances, and you have to know that going in. So yes, once you make a commitment to be unconditionally happy and use this as a path to your spirituality, it will cause you to grow spiritually, because things will occur that could cause you to break that vow or that commitment that you made, and that's the work that you have to do. That's your spiritual work, deciding each and every time something challenges your commitment not to break it. And if you do, Don't wallow in shame and unworthiness, but get right back up on the horse and start again. Back to the book once more. The purpose of your life is to enjoy and learn from your experiences. You were not put on earth to suffer, and you're not helping anybody else by being miserable. Regardless of your philosophical beliefs, the fact is, if you were born, you are eventually going to die. During the time in between, you get to choose whether or not you want to enjoy the experience. Events don't determine whether or not you're going to be happy. They're just events, containers, forms. You, which frequency you decide to be on, determine whether or not you're going to be happy. All right. This path will lead you to absolute transcendence. So remember a few minutes ago we said that spirit is above our definitions and our forms. That's what that means. This path will lead you to absolute spirit, because spirit is transcendence. Because any part of you that would put a condition on your happiness has to go. If you truly want to be unconditionally happy, you have to let go of the part of you that wants to create melodrama. This is the part of you that thinks there's a reason not to be happy. As you let go of this part of yourself, you will awaken the higher aspects of your being. In the end, enjoying all of life's experiences is the only rational thing to do. After all, you're sitting on a planet, spinning around in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Go ahead, take a look at reality. You're floating empty in empty space in a universe that goes on forever. Since you're here, you might as well enjoy yourself. Things beyond your control that you might not prefer are going to happen. You are going to die at some point. But why shouldn't you be happy? You gain nothing by being bothered by life's events. Your being bothered changes nothing. You just suffer. There will always be things that bother you if you let them. But the choice to enjoy life anyway will lead you on your spiritual journey. Committing yourself to unconditional happiness, and as I said before, you could replace happiness with anything, love, surrender, whatever. Committing yourself to unconditional anything will teach you everything you need to know about yourself, about others, and about the nature of life. You will learn all about your mind, your heart, and your will. So how do you do this? Every time a part of you begins to be unhappy, let it go. Work with it. Use affirmations or do whatever you need to do to keep your heart open. If you are committed, nothing can stop you, no matter what happens. As difficult as it sounds, just enjoy life as it comes to you. What's the benefit of not doing this? In the end, if you stay happy no matter what, you win. Make that your goal. Or going back to what Michael Beckwith said, and what we understood from that piece, make this your choice. Next, question why it is you think it's necessary to be unhappy about something. Why, when something happens, ask yourself if you're really willing to give up on your commitment because of it. For instance, you're having a great day until someone cuts you off in traffic. It really upsets you in the moment, but you stay upset for the rest of the day. Why? Dare to ask yourself the question, what good came from letting that ruin your day? There was no benefit. So someone cut you off, let it go. Giving away your happiness for that is not worth it. If you really decide to let it go, even if it's a much bigger issue than this, you can. Spiritual practices are not an end in themselves. They only bear fruit when your commitment to them allows you to remain open and true to the path you've chosen, no matter what. So that's the end of the information from the book, The Untethered Soul. So let's talk about happiness being your path, or anything, commitment to something being your path, and the fruit that it can bear in your life by having that attitude of no matter what for a minute, and seeing how deciding to be happy can be a choice and not dependent on your circumstances or on events that occur in your life. He made this transition. He has made his transition now. But there was a man who used to frequent the cathedral for many years. His name was Bob Gass, and he used to speak for us regularly. He was a great storyteller, and one of the most memorable stories he ever told was about a bear who had for years lived in captivity within the confines of a cage at a zoo. And Bob would pace back and forth across the stage to demonstrate how big the bear's cage was. As he said, every day for years and years, the bear would walk the length of his cage, 12 steps forward and 12 steps back. And then, one day, for some reason, the zoo decided to return the bear to the wild. And they took him to one of the most beautiful national parks in the whole world, where he had nothing but acres and acres and miles of open forest to explore. But the bear had spent so many years in that cage that even when he was free to go anywhere he wanted, he still stayed within the invisible parameters of his old cage and would only walk 12 steps forward and 12 steps back. Like we talked about earlier, holding on to that penny for dear life when all you have to do is turn around and see the pile of $20 billion behind you. So what we have here are events occurring in the bear's life that were beyond his control, both his capture and his release. But even when he was physically set free, in his mind, he was still imprisoned in that cage because that's what he was committed to, no matter what, was the habit he had formed during his years in the zoo. And that's the fruit that his practice bore. Even though an event occurred that freed him, his commitment to a certain path had set his habit, which was still controlling his behavior. He could have and should have been deliriously happy roaming the wide expanse of that national park. But the path he had chosen, the frequency he had chosen, led him to remain forever in a prison of his own making. Now, let's shift a little bit to a completely different scenario, but also one involving a prison. The biblical story of Paul and Silas. An event also occurred in their lives that landed them in jail. So this, just like with the bear, was a circumstance beyond their control. What did we say just a few minutes ago? Things will occur in your life from time to time that you would prefer not to have happened. But when they do, that's when your spiritual path, whatever it has been, when the choices you have made kick in and they start bearing the fruit of what you have committed to, no matter what. The bear was in prison mentally, even though he was physically free. Paul and Silas, on the other hand, were free and happy in their hearts and in their minds, regardless of the fact that they were physically in prison. So they started singing at midnight, and we all know the rest of that story. The locks fell off the cell doors, and an earthquake of sorts destroyed the jail, making them physically free once again. As Pastor Lonnie often says also, get happy and see what happens, and that's exactly what they did. We've been taught the exact opposite, that events and circumstances occur, and then as a result of those circumstances, we are either happy or unhappy. But that's still looking for the path to happiness, which is nothing but an illusion. That is hanging on to forms and containers that our ego has created. Once we realize happiness and choosing happiness, no matter what, is the path, then positive events will begin to occur. Then our practice will begin to bear the fruit that we can see. And I'll add to that from our teaching today, once we realize that everything is energy, our whole perspective shifts and we are able to go up to that higher frequency. And that's when we can say and truly know, as above, so below. As within, so without. It all happens within us first. So I want the very last thing that I leave in your hearts. I was all finished with this, and then this morning as I was getting ready, I was listening to some music, and the Eagles song, Already Gone, came on. And that song has one of my very favorite lyrics of all time, and that's what I want to leave with you today. It says, so oftentimes it happens that we live our lives in chains, and we never even know we have the key. We have that key, And that key is choosing what frequency we're going to live on. Amen? Amen. Thank you so much for joining me today. I love you. We will see you again tomorrow night at 6:30 for our continuing series, The New Earth by Eckhart Tolle, and then on Sunday, either in church or online. Bye-bye. Have a great week.